to Katryna, who's going to lead us through to lunch.
Do we have a clicker?
No, we don't.
Okay, all right, we'll the old-fashioned way.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
So just on.
And so that was an interesting segue into identity. We're a small group today, so please feel like you can interrupt me. I'll aim to sort of whiz through this in about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and happy if you interrupt with questions along the way. Very briefly, I am the founder and CEO of a company called Meeco. We often talk about Meeco enabling the API of me. So we see, I was going to say in the not too distant future, but actually it's now. Everything we touch, wear, do, see has some input and output from a data point of view. And our identity, whether or not it's our real identity or it's something that identifies us, is wrapped around that data and information. And we believe very strongly that there is an opportunity for individuals, citizens, customers, patients, students to bring their data and identity into the enterprises and organisations that they trust in a collaborative way. And it speaks really to a lot of the great points that were made on the panel a few minutes ago, is that the shift that we see happening, and if there is a shift around the me part of it, it's this idea that convenience and removing friction is going to trump a whole host of things. And so what is unanimous across an emerging digital generation is ease and convenience. And the idea that I have to download 50 different apps for the 3 banks that I have, and my toaster, and my car, and the electricity grid, and the solar panel, and the, like da-da-da-da-da, it goes on and on and on. The idea that if I had $100 for every bank that says they're working on the killer app, it's crazy. And so there is this shift and there's this dance at the moment, which is why a lot of the work we see being done by Kantara and YX and is so important at the moment, is trying to find this middle ground where we can actually start to build into the value chain. I gave this talk a few weeks ago in Paris, which I called Tales from Around the Globe, or View from the Bridge. And really, it's sort of some of the war wounds of the last 9 months of my life, really. I've been on 3 continents on a monthly basis, and so it's biased towards the things that are shifting in Europe, which again the panel talked about, some of the things we're starting to see bubbling up in Australasia, or Australia in particular, and also some of the challenges for US-centric companies that have a global operation and have carte blanche around a lot of things like identity and data, but find that things that are everyday in a US context could actually end up having a chief executive facing a prison sentence in Europe. And so we have these very strange tensions. So what I'd like to do is just talk to you around some of those observations. Tomorrow or the next day, whenever I'm presenting, I'll get into the nuts and bolts of some practical things we're doing from a technology point of view, and also some use cases. But today I just wanted to sort of look at some of those challenges in the hope that if that regulation is not bearing down on your organisation right now, there's an opportunity to be innovation-led rather than compliance-led. When we think about identity, or the idea of SIAM, we see that as obviously real identity, or the ability for me to federate the different roles in my life. Something that's privacy enhancing in that I can be known by either a persona or I can create something that is recognizable in an omni-channel situation without necessarily giving away who I am. We're looking towards what we call the new normal, and I'll talk about that very briefly, and that is, how do you market to somebody from a global point of view, if you are a global organisation, and satisfy these competing requirements in a way that does create content that is personalised, and then how does that fit with your digital transformation? So I'm just going to share with you some of the things that we've seen over the last 12 months, but I would say more challenging in the last 3 months, and I think the next 6 months ahead in particular. So the key things that we see is there are obviously drivers right now to a lot of this change, although I would say KuppingerCole has been at the forefront of talking about the whole SIAM opportunity for maybe longer than necessarily the market has had that conversation. So I would urge some of their early white papers are a really great signpost to things that are really just becoming obvious to a lot of enterprises right now. The tensions, and with all tensions come opportunities. And so as I said, when we look at the individual, and this is borrowed and influenced by some of the reporting that KuppingerCole is doing in the science space, is we look at what does it look like to have the individual in the middle, and how do we start to balance this identity and access management with the regulatory drivers, with the need for digital transformation, or at least trying to bring together those omni-channel entry points for customers, and the desire or requirement for a digital generation to have marketing that is personalised or content relevant in a way that can differentiate a brand or elevate service, and at the same time be cool rather than creepy. And there's a very fine line between those two extremes, which is the importance of consent. When we think of SIAM from the perspective of the individual, we think of something that's customer-centric, that's context-driven and consent-based always. Because the interesting thing for organisations, particularly under GDPR, is that if you get the context and the consent matched right, then what our studies have shown is individuals are actually willing to share more information rather than less, if they understand why the data is being collected, how it's going to be used, the context of the and the benefit that is associated with that consent. Obviously, these regulatory drivers are accelerating some of the opportunities, and as Colin talked about earlier on, and the panel now, it also creates challenges for organisations in terms of how they respond to these drivers. So these are predominantly European drivers at the moment, although Australia is just starting to make a bold move towards open banking, so we're going to see some big changes in our financial services environment. My background before founding Meeco, I worked in financial services for a decade, and in fact it was part of what inspired me to found Meeco, because I realised every day we were manufacturing financial products here, and the customer was here, and we were constantly going like this. And we had this idea that we would create this mortgage product or this insurance product, and we'd create it in January, and we'd put it on the marketing calendar for September, as if every single customer was going to wake up in September with that need. And so what we weren't able to do consistently was what I used to say is be the first service provider on the scene of change. You know, having a child, a promotion, changing jobs, an inheritance, moving countries, proving your identity, all of these things that are every day. How do you start to bring those two things together? And so I think there's going to be a huge shake-up in financial services if banks only look towards PSD2 compliance, as in, here's your data, versus here's how we can help you make better decisions real time through the access and sharing and collaboration of your data. Then we look to the US, and we know there are tensions at the moment around data privacy divide. And so many of the things, without making any comments about the current administration, shall I say that some of the hard-fought rights for American citizens in the previous administration, we're starting to see those roll back. And this is creating a lot of confusion for American-centred, headquartered organisations. And then in Australia, our Productivity Commissioner published 2 reports, one at the end of last year, and then earlier, or I think it was May this year, was the second draft that went to Treasury, which I'm sure has influenced where we've got to with open banking as well, and has gone as far as to say that Australian citizens, that they believe there's a comprehensive right to data control for consumers, and that data actually at a household level is an asset. So what does that start to look like? Well, how do we start to solve this data paradox? And the data paradox we see right now is individuals actually want more personalisation. They want to be understood in an omni-channel way, whether or not they're on the phone, or they're coming through a digital channel, or they're walking into a branch. They want their service tailored to their outcome. But at the same time, we see enormous trust declining in the way that data and information is collected and managed. You know, whether or not we look to Uber recently, or Equifax, or I can't even remember who I read about last week and the size of the data breach. But the problem is we read about these weekly now, and we're talking about tens of millions of people's records that are put at stake. And it's almost to the point of now, oh, I wonder who it is this week. But in being in the US just recently and talking to some of the banks, they say that the Equifax issues for some Americans will mean either lack of or hurdles to credit for the next decade of their life. And that's an extraordinary impact also from a digital point of view, because if you think that you have to physically ID people, or you need branches open, or you need additional fraud checks in place to make sure someone is someone that you can trust, then the ability for you to march ahead in terms of your digital transformation is significantly impacted. And then if you're Wells Fargo that moved quickly into some digital channels, and then that digital channel enabled the kind of fraud that went on around customers' accounts, this paradox is growing ever more apart, the tension. So we see a pattern emerging on all three continents, driven largely around the same ideas, which is silo thinking. You know, we see this problem every day between either the privacy compliance side of where the spending is going, or the marketing personalisation. And there is really, these are really on two shores. And it's not that there isn't a lack of funds. The number of times that we speak to somebody on, say, the marketing or innovation side of an enterprise who says, GDPR, open banking, we don't need to worry about it, the lawyers are taking care of it. And you think, okay, that's going to be really interesting from a UX and a customer experience point of view come next year, when the lawyer says, no problem, you can do anything you want. There's just this 50 checkbox list that a customer needs to work through when they open a new product or service. So we know that's not going to work. And so whilst those funds are in circulation right now, what we don't see is people thinking, well, what does the new normal look like when these things come together? And so there's a lot being invested in Europe in terms of the data mapping. Where's the data? I mean, the cookie things that Colin spoke about this morning, again, I've been in the US quite a bit the last couple of months. There are so many US headquartered companies that would dispute, hands down, that that is going to be the case, unquestionably. I was with a very large digital advertiser last week and mentioned the cookie thing, and I was laughed at. Just said, well, that's the most ridiculous thing we've ever. How will they even know that we've taken their cookies? That's just crazy. You know. And you're thinking, okay, I'm speaking to somebody now that is a very senior executive in a Fortune 100 company with a huge brand recognition. And this person is probably, after bonus paid $500,000 a year. And they're actually just laughing at me right now and saying this doesn't apply. And so we're in for a really interesting time next year. Particularly because organisations are still trying to manage the whole digital transformation. And so what we see that's really important, and I think this is the opportunity for other parts of the world that may not be under the same deadlines, is this portfolio approach, this integrated approach. We see at the moment there are these three growing networks. And if an organisation and government can get this right for their citizens, for their customers, it's actually a way of unlocking those networks in a horizontal way. So there are the enterprise networks where you may find an organisation is a super brand and then it has a portfolio of brands. And so what it's trying to do is solve the customer identity aspect from the point of view of portability, from the bank to their insurance product, or from their insurance product in the house across to the insurance product with the car. And then looking to see how they can, within the regulatory environment, remove some of the friction. Then we have the traditional walled gardens like Apple and Google and Tesla that are creating maybe a fantastic experience if you're in the garden, but absolute hell if you move outside of the garden, because the portability isn't there, or the whole point of the Faustian bargain, you know, particularly with Apple, you know, everything I touch, where, you know, it's hanging off my body or I'm clicking every day is Apple. And the idea of me moving into another environment would just be, you know, countless thousands of hours of pain. And so you know, I'm kind of stuck in that environment. And then the third, which is where I think the important work that's being done from a standards point of view, is this open networks, this idea of horizontally enabling a customer to move seamlessly across these different channels. And this is really critical because whilst we see governments being focused on solving some identity issues, it's within the context of your role as a citizen. And if we start to think about things from the perspective of the individual, you know, we have roles as citizen, as employees, as parents, we have our reputation, our professional reputation to manage, we have our financial life, we have our health, we have our personal interests, and our persona, if you like, changes dramatically across those different roles. And the problem is we don't see anywhere right now, whether or not it's a government or whether or not it's an enterprise, that understands the nuance of that from an individual's point of view. So I think who's going to win this race will be organisations focused on unlocking that horizontal value for customers and allowing them to move around in a seamless way. I'm constantly asked what's the killer app. I don't think there will be a killer app. I think it's going to be the seamlessness of being able to bring your trusted identity and move that into a trusted space for a specific outcome in the most frictionless way as possible. So we also see value chains are rapidly evolving to include people and things. And so when we talk about identity right now, do you mean me or me in my car? Or the car with my partner in the car now? Are we talking about my credit card attached to the car for payment? Or are we talking about I got out of the car, my partner got in, and that credit card? And so when we start to think about the idea that a car has an identity, our home has an identity, our wearables have an identity, and we're either attached to or we want to detach from those things as we move in and out of that environment, the whole concept of identity is becoming significantly more complex. And then not to mention friction forward, which I talked about briefly. You know, one of the issues that we have is the honeypot just doesn't work. And so the ability for the individual to feel that their data is actually distributed is really critical. This was a quote from a book which I think is called Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus. I believe it came out either at the end of last year or earlier this year. This speaks to Colin's point as well around the whole cookie issue. And again, to the conversation I had in the US last week, you know, tens of millions, billions of dollars that are actually being spent on, you know, click farms and bots. And so, you know, this idea of the business model and how do we monetize people's identity, you know, there is so much fraud right now in the system. And there's so much value sitting on the table if we can solve this. We can't imagine the number of new business models that are possible. I think this is a really important thing for the emerging generation as well. We've seen the rise of ad blocking. We talked a little bit earlier around the idea of whether or not young people care about privacy. But what they do care about are things on their own terms. And so if we're seeing ad blocking now, and we're going to, this paradigm moves out to either where we're being scanned from a biometric point of view or this scene that from a Minority Report, it's the idea that there isn't going to be, even if it's from a European context, there isn't going to continue to be this carte blanche to say, I want to reach into an individual's life and bombard them in some way, because it's human nature for people to find a way to work around it, whether or not it's the spam email account or whatever the case may be. So we have to find a solution that doesn't create resistance, because there's cost in resistance, and ultimately, if a brand wants to connect, or a government wants to connect, or an airline wants to connect with a passenger, with a citizen for an outcome, then how do we try and make that handshake as trusted as possible? So what's required to unlock this value? And this is something that I'll talk about in the next couple of days. We've been working on what it looks like for the individual to bring their API and plug it into a customer journey and actually help remove some of that friction and increase the trust. We also know that right now we're on this cusp of the current business models, which are around collecting, storing, and monetizing the data. And again, we've already, in the brief time we've been together today, this point's already come up 2 or 3 times, is there are new models. We're trying to graft 19th century, 20th century concepts. We're taking old processes and making them digital and thinking, oh, we will just bring the same value proposition or we'll bring the same business model along. And it just doesn't work in that way. Society is looking at new forms of equity and new forms of value, and whether or not you think Bitcoin right now is a huge bubble that is going to burst, or whether or not there is confidence at all in what's happening with distributed. It's a phenomenon that is significantly shaking society right now to say, does a country have the only right to issue a currency? Or you have someone like Estonia right now who's saying, well, should we issue a digital currency alongside our physical currency? And then Venezuela, I saw last week, I was reading about the inflation, and I was thinking, I went to bed, I read the article, I was thinking, oh, why don't they just issue their own coin? That would be a way around the sanctions. I woke up the next morning and there in the newspaper, Venezuela is saying they're going to issue a coin pegged to their rich resources as a means of working around the sanctions. And so whether or not we think these things are here to stay or not, we really need to be thinking of what this new normal looks like. And we know what's driving that is the policy, the privacy issues, data in silos, onboarding friction, diminishing trust, KYC, AML, regulation. These costs are growing in the financial services sector. They're growing for government. So if we don't find a way to bring this portfolio approach to solving these things, it's not like those costs are going to go away. And so where we see things shifting is to the individual as an enabler to unlock this. And this is a big part of our philosophy, what it looks like to put the citizen, the passenger, the patient in the middle of this ecosystem. And then wrap around that strong identity and consent with the control and the privacy management. And what we've seen by testing this time and time again is if that transparency is there, you start to unlock a world of value of data and information, social accounts, wearables, bank accounts, health data, travel data, that is either under the full or semi-control or permission of the individual into this ecosystem of value where that can actually flow into kind of integrated end-to-end services. And I think this is really the huge opportunity that lies ahead. Also from a design point of view, we look at the idea of minimal viable collection for maximal viable access. And this is where verified attributes come in. Do you need my date of birth, or do you need to know I'm over a certain age to consume alcohol, to board this flight, or whatever the case is? And so starting to think about the way we design digital experiences to ask a very simple binary question that's almost a yes or no, as opposed to the data collection. What we're seeing is not only does that speed up the opportunity for digital transformation, but it also lowers some of the compliance and risks associated with storing that data and managing that data. Use cases. Again, I'll speak about this, or I'm happy to talk to you over the next couple of days. Participation drive models. Every time we see a cohort of customers or students invited in to, looking at what the student admin experience is like, or a patient in terms of the relationship between the hospital and the insurance company and physician, or the customer in some sort of digital channel where they have a digital experience. They might start off in a shop, or they might start off in a showroom, and then they end up completing that purchase and through some sort of digital channel. Every time you bring the individual in, there's transformation in terms of how that value chain starts to develop. And our numbers are, they're small cohorts, but they're upwards of 80-something, 90-something%. Because where that trust and transparency is there, and the person is actually empowered to be part of the value chain, people actually share more information. They're clear about how the information is being collected and how it's being used. people become much, much more collaborative around it. And, you know, if there is anything that we're seeing from this emerging digital generation, it may be not so much that the focus is on privacy, it's around an outcome, it's around a value proposition exchange. And that's really what is going to have organisations in a competitive environment win over each other, is who can create a great user experience, who can provide the outcome, but who can do that in a way that differentiates, whether or not that's by empowering the individual or giving them something that is a value proposition over and above the service that's being offered. And we've been testing this. You know, there are 3 sectors that we focus on: government, financial services, and telecommunications. And those are areas that are data rich, that are under a lot of threats from a regulatory point of view, where there is huge opportunity to create new value. So the one thing that I would say in closing is that we've seen, in trying to balance and harmonise these tensions, is obviously for anyone in Europe, they have to have started out towards GDPR open banking. That's not even a choice now. I'm happy to say that some organisations that I first talked to a year ago kind of went, this may all blow over, at least are conceding, no, we're busily data mapping now to find where our customer data is. This portfolio approach, getting different parts of the organisation speaking to each other and looking at the whole identity, personalisation, omni-channel experience, and the regulation, you know, as a holistic component is really critical. And then I would say the most important thing, plan for the new end state, because we see a lot of organisations seeing some of these regulatory changes as a point in time, a bit like Y2K, for those of you that are old enough to even know what that is. The point of it is this isn't going to be that we reach these milestone dates. It's like, tick, we've been through that compliance regime and we've done what we need to do. Now we can, you know, everything goes back to normal. You know, whether or not it's around the cookie policy or whether it's around open APIs from a banking point of view, or if it's around framing consent when you're booking an airline ticket. This is the new end state. And the ability to start taking some of the open standard work that's being done and thinking about what it will look like to bring the customer directly into that value chain in a more collaborative way, I think is going to be where we're going to see significant value. So last but not least, leave you with this idea. We see increasing evidence for this. Doesn't necessarily mean that it will be the way that organisations embrace this opportunity, but we see more and more that the hallmark of a future-proof organisation or government or airline is going to be the willingness to share the data it collects about its customers directly with its customers for mutual value. And, you know, there is a commercial side to this. We see that it does drive revenue, it does increase loyalty. If you can manage your risk and reduce your costs by building that actually into the customer experience, then there's the ability to tick, you know, all of those boxes. But I would say the most important thing is to see that customers are really the platform opportunity right ahead, and to take this innovation approach by thinking, how do we bring that data, consent, permission into the organisation, as opposed to putting up the roadblocks to do the minimum from a compliance point of view. So I think May, June 2018 will be an interesting time. I can't wait to circle back to some organisations that have said, everything's going to be fine, and then it's like, our lawyers have just said we need to do this. And we'll be like, really? So I guess for those of us in the room that are working on building solutions, I think the fun has only just begun, and there are some interesting times ahead. Thank you.
That's a quick question.
Yes.
What is the use case for that? I mean, right now, I as a citizen don't want my information shared. But with my information from the bank, I don't want to share it with anyone else.
No, but this is sharing it with you. So what we're seeing is that, so I'll give you 3 scenarios. with banks right now. A bank that said, you know what, we want to be first, we want to have a sandbox of APIs, we want to make it available for customers, we want to understand the kinds of things they want to do, because we think we'll be able to build new products out of it, you know, whether or not it's, you know, insight capability or because customers don't really want the data. It's not really about the data, it's about the insight, it's about making better decisions, it's about being more informed. So we have Bank A saying, we think the faster we're there, the more we will be able to grab a digital generation that wants to collaborate with the information. Bank C over here saying, it's all going to blow over, we will do the minimum, we will begrudgingly give a customer what they want, but we're going to make it as hard for them as possible within the law. And then, you know, in the middle saying, well, we're not really sure whether or not a customer is going to want access to their data and information, so we'll make sure that we can do it, but it's not going to be an innovation driver for us. What we're saying,
very different strategic plays.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing is the organisation saying, we think that right now we're a bank, or we're a telco, or we're a whatever. We think this collaborative approach means that we can move into new markets, or offer concierge services, or integrate more horizontally with our B2B relationships. It's going to be the consent from the customer to collaborate on that data. So it's not about a B2B giving the data away, it's about whether or not they position themselves to have access to the information to help customers make better decisions, or just have a better sort of integrated channel experience. And look, you know, we'll see who wins out of those three strategies. But from a customer point of view, it's certainly evident that the ability to be part of that value chain and be rewarded for it is a lot more attractive than sort of beating the door down of, you know, banking approach C, which is, you know, can I have my transaction data?
Very good. Thank you very much, Katryna.